Sorry about the delay. We had a couple of technical difficulties, but we're all squared away now. Once again, we're really appreciative of you all coming and supporting our Sustainability Showcase series. Today we're fortunate to have Dr. David Titley from the College of EMS come to speak. He has a lot of incredible, valuable experience to share with us today, including some of his past experience with the Navy, where he was Rear Admiral for them. So we're really excited to have him here. Feel free once again to ask questions. We're really excited to hear some of his expertise and words of wisdom regarding his experience with sustainability. And with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. David Titley. For questions.
Ways. Now it's on. Okay, good, thanks. Okay, so what I'll try to do here in about 25 or 30 minutes is just kind of go through how I talk about climate risk really as a risk to security, as an accelerating risk to security. So how you fix that, I'll kind of give you what we would call in the Navy the bottom line up front, is a lot of the sustainability issues that your institute, that people here are probably interested in. But it is another aspect of climate that we don't always necessarily think about. A lot of times we think about polar bears, we think about other environmental concerns, and those are all very, very much there. But we also have these security issues, really fundamental to national and international security and stability, that if we don't address by addressing the root causes of climate change, we're going to find those are issues too, in addition to all the environmental issues that I'm sure you're pretty familiar with there. Okay, so this is kind of an outline of what we'll do, and we'll, as I said, I probably won't get through quite everything here, but we'll go to about 30 minutes. So I'll just quickly go through, you know, if you guys all came here expecting a climate talk, right, of some sort. So I would be remiss. In fact, I think it's illegal if I don't have at least one slide with a whole lot of red in the middle and scary colors, purples, reds. You know, you got to have that because otherwise you actually get your climate card taken away from you, and you don't want that. So yes, we'll talk plenty of climate, but I think it's also important to remember that climate change both affects and is affected by a lot of the other big issues that we have going on in the world. You know, we got a ton of people. I guess that's sort of the technical phrase there. You know, 7 billion going arguably to somewhere between 9 and 10 billion by the end of this century. Yes, when climate has changed before significantly, you know, probably the number of humans on the Earth was 1 million or less. You know, so basically you could take all the people who are, let's say, in Center City, Philadelphia, and fill the Earth. You know, so then if the climate changes, it's not quite as big a deal. We got a whole lot more people now, and we continue to add people. And those people all want, and I would argue expect, because we sure do, adequate food, adequate water, adequate energy. Of those three, I would argue that water is probably the key one. If you have water, you can kind of figure out food, you can kind of figure out energy. Without water, a lot of that gets really hard. We are globalized, whether we want to be or not, and that could be a whole nother seminar for another day, whether globalization is good or bad, but it's kind of a reality. So we don't get the luxury, let's say sitting in Pennsylvania, where maybe the near-term climate impacts are not perhaps as severe as other places, of saying, well, it kind of sucks to be them, because we're all connected. We're connected economically, we're connected socially, we're connected through social media. So what happens halfway around the world, let's say in Thailand, can and will impact us. And speaking of technology, now my students think I have the phone on the left. I don't anymore as of 2 weeks ago. So again, we could have a whole seminar on technology, but one of the many, many, many things technology increase has done is I would argue it's forced transparency. We all have a much better idea of what's going on in other lands and other places. The rest of the world has a pretty good idea of what we use and what we consume in America. It's not a secret. It's really easy to see. Also, when I talk to some of my friends on this, and if they kind of think that we're going down, kind of the conspiracy road, it's like, you can't do that anymore. The technology really doesn't let you do that. Oh, by the way, I worked for the government for 35 years. I can tell you they're not good enough to do a big conspiracy on climate change. I mean, remember, this is the same government that under the past administration couldn't even build a website for their president's highest domestic priority. How are they going to do a conspiracy? But I digress. So we have transparency. We have transparency. And then we tell ourselves, this is one of the recent G7 economic conferences, we tell ourselves that we're out of money. Now, is that true? Is that not true? Again, we could go to the business school and talk to a lot of economists, and they would, maybe agree, maybe disagree, but that's part of our self-talk. So kind of, I'm not going to keep coming back to all of this, but I just ask you kind of park in your brain somewhere. In addition to climate, we have population growth, we have resource competition, globalization, ever-increasing technology, which leads to transparency, amongst other things. And our self-talk is that we're out of money, and now we're going to go change the climate. So those are kind of all issues that both impact climate change and, in turn, get impacted by the changes in climate. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture. Why we care, I kind of talked about this a little bit. If you've seen my talks before, I don't have the polar bear here. I don't have that poor, scrawny polar bear on that little piece of ice floating away here. Nothing against polar bears, although it is a little unnerving when you land in a far northern Canadian field in November at 2 p.m. and it's pitch black because it's dark. And they say, oh, by the way, be careful, there are a couple polar bears somewhere on the ramp, but we don't know where they are. So, that true story. But what I do think about is 3 words: people, water, and change. Why 3 words? I can only remember 3 things at one time. If you give me 7 or 8 or 9, I'm not going to remember them all. And climate is massive, right? I mean, it's this huge thing. You can write thousands, and it has thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and it's so easy, at least for me, with my small little brain, it's so easy to get overwhelmed. But if you can kind of like reduce it, and yes, you lose stuff, there's a lot of people here who can talk about reducing dimensions and things like that, but if you can kind of break it down into stuff, it makes it a little bit easier to remember, at least. So I talk about people, water, change. Why is that? This is not just an environmental issue. It's not just a polar bear issue. It's not just something that happens, thousands and thousands of kilometers away at some kind of future date, maybe. This is about you and me. This is about you and me. This is about us. It's about our families. It's about our children. It's about our parents. It's about our neighbors in our towns, in our school districts, in our region, and really in the country. This is a people issue. We are all going to be impacted, either directly or certainly indirectly. Who cares about sea level rise here? It's a sustainability issue. You guys are all going to. But when I give this talk in Nebraska, it's like, ha, 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 haven't you looked? You were in the middle of the country. So I asked them 2 things when I've given this talk at Nebraska. We'll beat them, by the way, in a few weeks. But I've given this talk, and it's like, well, tell me 2 things. Where does all that corn that I see around here and wheat, where does that get shipped out of? Oh, it goes down the Mississippi, down to New Orleans. Well, you probably want a port. 2, and when everybody gets flooded out from the increasing storm surges, who do you think pays? It's you guys. It's taxpayers. We're all paying. I call it the carbon tax that we never voted on, because that's kind of what's happening there. So we are all going to be affected. This is a people issue. The second part, as you can probably kind of figure out from this graphic, is I like to use water as an integrating principle. I was using this about 5 years before Penn State put water into their strategic plan, so no, this is not sucking up to the president. But really, this is sort of an iconic, I'll bet a lot of people have seen this here, from the US Geological Survey, kind of an iconic image. That big blue one, the one everybody can see, this is like if you took all the water, all the oceans, and put it to scale in a sphere on the Earth. That's about how big it is. This one you can kind of see. This is all the fresh water, sort of a dot over, I guess, let's say Tennessee. And this little dot that I'll bet if you're outside the front row you can't even see, that's the usable fresh water. So there's not a ton, but there is enough. But what's happening with climate change is we are fundamentally changing the way that water moves around the Earth and the state that water's in. So I tell people with the water we have too much, too little, wrong place, wrong time. Salty where it used to be fresh, wet where it used to be dry, liquid where it used to be solid. And in fact, even in the oceans, the very chemistry of the oceans themselves are changing with the acidification issue. And it's really hard to have life without water. So that, to me, is an integrating principle. You can certainly argue for others, but then when you're talking to people, it's like, hey, let's just talk about the water. I tell people it's all about the water. And then finally, the change. I mentioned people, water, change. Who here in central Pennsylvania thinks we have an ideal climate? Because if anybody raised their hands, you haven't been here. Oh, ideal climate, my God. Okay, I'm not so sure about that. But, you know, because I like sunshine, and starting in about a month from now, we're not going to see it for a long time. I tell people if you've lived in Hawaii or San Diego, you guys probably have ideal climates. So ideal is in our perception, right? But what we have had, really for the last 8,000 to 10,000 years, is a stable climate. So you could argue in different parts of the world whether it's ideal or not, but it's been more or less within natural variability bounds. It's been stable. So what did that mean? It meant that we knew what we could grow, when we could harvest, pretty much what bugs and critters we did or did not have to deal with. It meant if you built a port that you were reasonably certain that the ocean would be there the next year, the next decade, the next century, and you weren't going to have to keep moving your port up or down in elevation. And we built civilization. You know, it's not like we actually had somebody said, hey, we're out of the ice age. We're going to have 20,000 years of climate stability. Let's develop civilization. I don't think it happened that way. But this implicit premise of stability allowed human civilization to flourish. And, you know, and the next thing you know, we all have, you know, these things, right? We all have iPhones. Now we're changing that. And the question is going to be, this is kind of the fundamental question, how are we going to do this with, say, order 7 billion people, and really a civilization that is kind of being created on stability, and the implicit premise of, you know, everybody is kind of in their place. Treaty of Westphalia, right? So we all kind of have our place. So that's going to be the thing. So that's what I ask, you know, when people say, well, why do I care about climate? It's people, it's water, it's change. Okay, I'm going to, just in the interest of time, if you want to talk about risk, and we talk about, especially post-Harvey, you've heard a lot about the 1 in 100-year floodplain and the 1 in 500. Turns out, we can talk about this more in the more in Q&A if anybody's interested. That is probably the worst possible way to communicate risk and hazard. 1 in 100. Shoot, I'm not going to live to 100. Why should I care? Well, let's say if you built a house and you hope your house is going to be around for half a century, the chances of it getting flooded out are almost 40%. You know, if you really wanted only a 1% chance of flooding in a 50-year period, you have to build to the 1 in 5,000-year floodplain. And it's like, oh my God, nobody told me that. So we do a horrifically bad job, we collectively, at communicating these kind of risks. And, you know, since I'm talking to the Sustainability Institute, maybe that's something that you could think about. How do we better communicate these very real risks? This doesn't imply anything about changing risks or increasing risks. This is just like, even if it was a stationary, you know, basically the same. People build all the time right near or just outside of the 1 in 100-year flood, and they think they're in great shape. And in fact, they're taking massive risks. So we can talk about that more later. Okay, science. This is not going to be a science talk. Again, Q&A. If we want to talk science, I'm happy to talk the science of climate change. But here, in my very, very simple way of how I kind of think about, you know, the evidence, if you will, of science, it's really on this three-legged stool. Do we understand the basic physics and theory? Do the observations, do real-world observations, and ideally independent. So what does independent mean? They have nothing to do with each other, okay? So like looking at sea level rise and air temperatures, nothing really to do with each other, as an example. Or looking at how sea level rise and the migration of birds or some sort of ecosystem going either northward or poleward. Those are two pretty independent variables. And then finally, can we predict this stuff? Can we actually have some skill at projection? Because if you can do all three of those, I would argue you have some fair degree of understanding. And not too no, I'm not going to make you derive this. But we actually know this. So, you know, what is this? This is just the radiative transfer equations. And this actually we kind of figured out about 150 years ago. I tell people this is cutting edge 19th century science. The basics we have known for a very, very long time. We have mountains of observations we could do, and many universities, including ours, do. We do whole courses in climate dynamics and observations. We could spend all day doing that. We can actually predict this stuff. This happens to be from the set of global climate models that were run just about with Y2K, about 1998, 1999. They came out in 2000, and 2000 is where that vertical line is. So basically, the models need to fall somewhere in that gray area. All these colored lines are what reality was. So, you know, to the left of that, no, you don't really get a whole lot of credit for being inside there, because, I mean, I can get anybody to make the model work when I know the answer. But if you look going forward, it's not bad. And in fact, I need to update this figure. The last couple points are actually just a little bit above that black line. Climate models do not give you the year-to-year exact what it's going to do. What climate models do, though, is they do show you the trend. The trend is up, and we've been able to forecast that very well. Actually, a guy named Jim Hansen published in 1981, and his model is verifying pretty much like this. Actually, his is a little cold, but it verifies very well, and that's now coming up on 35-plus years of verification data. So we understand the theory, we understand we have lots of observations, and we can actually predict this stuff. And why? You know, it's a bunch of old guys from the 19th century, Fourier, Tyndall, Arnhus. So you had a Frenchman, a Swede, a Frenchman, a Scot, a Swede. They did not go into a bar. But by the end of it, they did figure out from first principles here with Fourier, yes, the same Fourier that you all know from Calc 140 and 141 and stuff, same guy. All the way to Arnhus, who actually said, hey, this Industrial Revolution thing's going on, a lot of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. He took his pencil and paper and started doing the first calculations there. So we've known this stuff for a long time. So again, happy to talk about it, but this is why when you hear climate scientists, the vast majority of climate scientists talk about this, why they have such high confidence that yes, not only is the climate changing, we know why, and it's going to keep going. Okay, let's talk about the security risk here. I apologize for having bullets. I really don't like words on slides. But this is really, again, three things, because I can only remember three things. What I think about as security risk. It changes where and how our defense, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are going to be able to work. It has a threat to our bases and our training ranges, a direct threat, like when Norfolk goes underwater, that's going to be bad for the world's largest naval base. What I'm going to talk about maybe a little bit more here is what I call making bad situations worse. I'll bet there are at least a few people here who remember the old BASF commercials. We don't make things, we make things better. Well, climate is sort of the opposite to that. We don't make things, we make things worse. And we'll talk about how climate can be an unexpected or an additional forcing function, and especially on a system that is already somewhat fragile or failing, it can be the thing that pushes it over there. So here's just another way that I can look at climate impacts on military or in security. And I'm really kind of looking at Arctic, again, that infrastructure, the bases, disaster relief, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then these sort of making bad things worse. The column headers, this is actually a slide I gave to 70 Allied heads of Navy a couple of years ago. So this is kind of written in security ease terms, and it's just kind of, why do I do that? You know, whenever you talk about kind of anything, the more you can talk about it in their language, not in yours, the better they are. So yes, I could have made this look very scientific and lots of, partial differential equations. They would have just picked up their iPhones and started playing with their texts and emails. But they all, if you're in the defense establishment or a senior policy analyst in security, you understand capacity, how much. Readiness simply means, yes, I have the stuff, but when the going gets tough, is it all going to work? Are the radios really going to work? Are my soldiers really trained to work in these adverse conditions? Is my tanks and aircraft and ships, are they really going to work when it gets hard? That's readiness. And then munitions means just what it sounds like there. We'll talk just a tiny bit about the Arctic, and when I have more time, I can show you shipping routes and how shipping routes change and how the ice is collapsing out of there, and I'll bet a lot of people know that anyways. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the wild cards, things that we don't really think about maybe quite as much. Whose flag is that? This one here on the upper right. Whose flag is that? Greenland. So what's Greenland part of? Denmark, yes, I know. My God, this sounds like high school geography class. But Greenland wants to be independent. And Denmark kind of says, hey, knock yourselves out, guys. The only problem is it turns out it's really expensive to be independent. So when oil came back down, they thought they were going to sell a ton of oil and make lots of money. So that hasn't worked out so well. So now they're talking about uranium mines. Guess who's really been courting Greenland assiduously for about the last 10 to 15 years? China. China has done a lot for infrastructure. They visit, they send their icebreaker over the Arctic and make sort of Greenland port visits. They're talking to them. They're trying to look at economic aid. Most people in the US, it's like Greenland, it's like, where's that? You know, so we don't really pay that much attention to them. Any idea what the population, the native population of Greenland is? It's 50,000. It's basically like taking University Park. Here, take the campus on a day we're in session, and that becomes a country. Who wants to be president? So, I mean, that's the scale. And it's a pretty big, now yes, Mercator projections distort it, but it's a pretty big chunk of real estate. And it's 50,000 people. So who's really going to run this? Well, the Chinese are more than happy to help. You know, and I would argue from a security perspective, we, the US, should kind of think about that. Is that in our interest? Is it not in our interest? If it is, that's okay. If it isn't, what are we going to do? So we should just think about it. The other picture down here, these are Russian air defense shields. The Russians have been building up a lot of stuff on their islands on the Northern Sea Route. Some people in the US are pretty concerned, others not so much. Who's been to Russia? Who's worked with the Russians? Somebody here must have. Okay, so Russians in general, open, welcoming, internationalist, paranoid, zero-sum. Kind of where are they? They're a little bit more over on that side, the paranoid, zero-sum things. So one of the things the Russians are always scared about is threats to the motherland. And something since the inception of their country roughly 1,000 years ago, they've had as a natural defense on that northern flank, which is thousands and thousands of kilometers long, is ice. Ice, natural barrier. Guess what's happening to that ice? Melting out. So the Russians are building up a lot of defenses, and some people I think in the US say, oh my God, they're like, you know, coming after us. It's like, no, I think they're just really building that up because they are paranoid. They think the West is going to come over the Arctic and attack from the north. I tell my Russian friends, look, we can't even find the Arctic, so that's probably not going to happen. But that's what they're doing. So yes, we should watch. It's the old Reagan trust but verify, but it's probably not as threatening as some people make it out to be. Okay, and yes, my friends, China, they have a very deliberate and ever-increasing program in the Arctic. Doesn't get a ton of press, but they're up there, and honestly, they're up there in some ways more than we are. Okay, bases. Really, when we think of places like Bangladesh, like some of the Pacific Island states, the challenge, and this is really almost back to the climate scientists and people like Dave Pollard and Richard Alley, a lot of the cutting-edge work is actually happening at Penn State on this very issue, is what's the scope, what's the rate, what's the magnitude of sea level rise? And a lot of that depends on how fast does the land ice, of course sea ice doesn't count, right? If sea ice melts, you don't change the elevation of sea level. But the land ice coming in, and what Pollard and Alley and their colleagues have found is that the ice can actually fracture. It's like God takes this giant sledgehammer and hits it. There's a little bit more technical explanation they have in their peer-reviewed literature, but basically they fracture the ice and it can fall back hundreds of kilometers almost instantly. And it actually kind of explains what we see in the old records, the paleo records, that the models, today's models, couldn't have. It's a little bit scary. It says that we could come up on sea level rise quite a bit faster than what we were thinking. If this is really slow, really gradual over terms of centuries, it's probably not great, but it's probably more manageable. If this happens 2-3 meters in a century, that's going to be really, really big disruptions. And if we're not thinking about how to take care of these people, that will be a security issue. It's a domestic issue as well. This is a graph of not sea level rise, but how many people, as of a few years ago, 2012, live within basically a meter, or let's say just over 3 feet of high tide. See all this red down here? Yeah, that's Florida. Who owns property south of Orlando? I would tell you to sell it. I'm actually kind of serious about that, because at some point, it's going to be worth zero. You might as well get something for it before everybody else figures that out. And yes, you can thank me on the way out. So, but that's going to happen. And you can see there are some other places where we have pretty high concentration. One we don't always think about on the East Coast is the Sacramento Delta. They're going to have some potential issues as well. So there's engineering issues. Do we make hard defenses? Do we use soft defenses? Do we use managed retreat? I mean, those are kind of the three options. South Florida is hard, right? Because what's the actual land down there? Well, it's swamp, yeah, but it's limestone. So fine, build the biggest levee you want. The water says, hey, that's cool, I'll just go under it. So, and then you get into the fresh water, and if you start pushing on the fresh water, if you start ending up basically salting up your fresh water supplies, you've got a real problem. So Florida's got a challenge there. Okay, disaster relief. These are just pictures from the last few weeks. I can tell you that the military is actually very good at doing this. It's also incredibly expensive. This is probably about the most expensive way to do disaster relief. Why? Because you're using assets that are basically built for, no kidding, hard-scale, full-on combat. You know, think about it. Do you really need a $6 billion nuclear aircraft carrier to go and deliver water bottles to people? I mean, that's what we're using. And they do it very well. We got helicopters. We have everything. There is a role probably to do that initial part when there's kind of like chaos around and stuff like that. But if we have to do this more and more, we might want to think as a nation or in cooperation with other countries. You know, is there like some sort of, I'll call it a constabulary force, much, much lower end, but still they have a uniform and they have a little flag, and it's like, hey, this is what we do. You know, we do, and we do it well. It's quite easy to train for, but we're not spending all the money that we're spending in the military to do that. I think that discussion hasn't really happened, but I think at some point it's going to have to. Okay, and then these security threats. So, you know, I'll just go quickly through and I'll talk about Syria because it's kind of the poster child for this. And unfortunately, it's about a 40-year history, which is really hard to put in 140 characters, but I tried on the right there. And if you've ever had to do like an accident investigation or been involved in one, many times you find out that, you know, there wasn't just one nice if-then. Rarely do you get those single causes. But you become a chain of events. And it's really tragic because you can see in retrospect that had you been able to break the chain at any one place, that aircraft wouldn't have crashed, that train wouldn't have fallen off the tracks or whatever, or Syria might not have fallen into where it did. This actually starts back in the early 70s. So Assad takes over, and one of his goals was to become self-sufficient in like wheat and barley. Now, you would hope an advisor would have said, you know, hey, boss, we're in the Eastern Mediterranean, kind of a desert, kind of dry here anyways, maybe not the best idea you've ever had. But instead, I think the advisor said, boss, you are a smart, powerful, and handsome man, and we will get right on that. Now, thank God that would never happen in this country. But, and they did. By the mid-90s, they were actually self-sufficient. But they did it at a tremendous cost, although they didn't realize it. They basically used up their aquifers. They used up a lot of their surface water, their rivers and stuff. So then there were a bunch of non-climate things happen, like the Iraq War. After 9/11, one of the many, many, many things that happened out of that is roughly 1 million Iraqi refugees fled into Syria, into the towns and cities in Syria. Now, this is Assad. It's not like he's known for taking care of his people, let alone refugees. So you're really pressurizing the cities. The government is not helping. I would argue it's actually fomenting unrest. Fast forward a few more years, up to like 2007, 2008, you have one of the worst droughts and heat waves, and the climate scientists can actually attribute the magnitude, the severity of that quite strongly to, in fact, the changing climate. And then the farmers have nothing. They just have nothing. Remember, we used up all those aquifers, and we used up all that surface water, becoming self-sufficient in the basic foodstuffs. So now you have about 750,000 of what we call internally displaced people, basically refugees within their own country, piling onto those million refugees in the cities, and you have Assad. You have a guy who's just whooping up on his own population. And what you end up with is a very fertile ground for breeding extremism. And you have a whole ton of desperate people. You know, you have families who are starving and they're dying of thirst and they're having horrific violence inflicted on them, and somebody comes up and says, join my group and I will feed you and give you water and protect you. You know, and we say, oh, how could you join a group like ISIS or like Al-Qaeda? Well, none of us have been in that situation, I'm willing to bet. You know, and it's probably something that, thank God, we haven't been. That's a horrific choice to have to make. And so, anyways, it becomes a recruiting ground, and then it's Katie bar the door, and we know kind of where Syria's gone from there. Okay, other issues that we don't always think about so much. So, no, this is not Finding Nemo, although I think he's around somewhere. But I mentioned that acidification issue. So you have a lot of small tropical nations that one of their major economic benefits is the 200 nautical mile, what we call exclusive economic zone, where basically they get the right to fish. But in general, as the waters warm and acidify, in general, the viable species, commercially viable species, tend to want to try to find waters that they were used to, which means usually going poleward, either north or south. So these countries that have for a long time had a fairly stable economic base are going to start losing them. How does that play out? Does the world care? And if we don't, how does that play out in security? Let me just keep going. So a few things to do here, and again, we're happy to talk more in the Q&A. You got to admit you have a problem. To Secretary Mattis's credit, he does. He was asked in his confirmation, actually, something called Questions for the Record. It's like, what's your views on climate change? And I thought he gave a very good answer. He talked about climate change as a risk, not the risk, but a risk to security. He's in charge of defense, and he's in charge of managing risks to security, and this is one of them, and he's going to manage it. I thought that was actually a pretty good answer, especially when you know where the White House stands on this issue. I've got a couple publications up here if anybody ever wants to look for them. The National Security Accelerating Risks of Climate Change. This is from a think tank of retired 3- and 4-star retired people. I was on that one. The other one, Implications for U.S. National Security of Anticipated Climate Change, rolls off the tongue. That's a national intelligence community product. So this is really our senior intelligence professionals, not politicians, but the senior intelligence professionals in the U.S. Came up with that. It's actually still out there. You can find it. It has not been buried. It has not been hidden. If you Google it, it'll come right up. It's on the Director of National Intelligence's website. So this is not just like, well, there's a couple crazy people talking about it. You have the intelligence folks. You got a bunch of 4-stars, and you have the Secretary of Defense who says, okay, we got to deal with this. A few more things you can read, but again, in the interest of time, we'll keep going. Who thinks we're going to solve climate change in your lifetime? Okay, one. Congratulations, you get the Optimism Award. I'm afraid I'm kind of with most of the other people here. I think this is going to be a risk we will manage. And how do we basically, when you have risks you manage, how do you buy down the worst? You know, how do you buy down the worst? So this is kind of, this actually comes from my good friend and colleague, Mike Mann. But, you know, some sort of probability distribution of what the likelihood is of how much warming we get when you get through, actually this is for 700, so almost, not quite, but almost a doubling of CO2. And most likely we're somewhere in this 2, 3, 4 degrees, which is probably going to be pretty exciting. It'll be pretty sporting. But there is sort of this chance, 10% or more, if all the positive feedbacks kind of line up, by no means given, but it could happen, 10% chance of 6, 7, 8 degrees warming. That is a different world. That's kind of like crocodiles at the North Pole kind of world. That's a very, very, very different world than where we have. 10%, is that a big risk or a small risk? Who's going to get on an airplane that has a 10% chance of crashing? I'll give you my seat. To me, that's a pretty big risk. I would want to buy that down. I would say, okay, if we can get that from 10 to 1 to 1/10 to maybe 1/100th, because that is a world that we would not recognize. These worlds are going to be bumpy. That's an unrecognizable world. So that's the risk we need to manage. Sustainability, you guys probably talk about this a lot, and you should. Fundamentally, we need to get to a non-carbon-based energy system. And we can argue how much that we need. I personally argue we need a ton of energy because we like living the lifestyle we do. We just need to do it in a non-carbon-based way. This is a slide I stole from Richard Alley, and he does this great talk about how this is really the third or fourth energy transition in our country. Wood to coal to liquid fossil fuels to probably some sort of non-carbon based. But what's the rate that we're going to change? Fast, slow, quick? Is government going to help or is government going to hinder? It's going to happen, but does it happen in 5 to 15 years or does it happen in 30 to 50? You know, those are the kind of things that you guys are going to have. I will save this for the Q&A, and if somebody's interested, you can ask me, why is there a llama in a climate change thing? And I will tell you. Okay, migration, I don't have time. We can talk about migration if you want. I put this in if I had time, but I don't. Is it fast or is it slow, and are they direct or indirect effects? But happy to talk about it again if somebody wants to. Possibly 200 million migrants, climate migrants, even though that isn't a defined term. It's not even an accepted term. But we could have, according to the International Organization on Migration, potentially order 200 million climate-related migrants. That's as many as exist in the world right now from all causes. That's a lot. Okay, final thoughts. Since I haven't been depressing enough, if you really want a wild card in all of this and a risk, think about climate intervention, or sometimes called geoengineering. I guess there's a movie out on this stuff now. I'm sure it's going to be great. Basically, what climate intervention or geoengineering is the intentional large-scale climate modification by man to undo the unintentional large-scale climate modification by man. What could possibly go wrong with that? So 2 different ways to do it. Suck the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, stick them back in the ground. Turns out that's pretty low risk. Really expensive, though, and really hard to do at the scales that matter. Or spray stuff in the atmosphere. And you can do that, and it's relatively affordable. We know how to do it. The trouble is not only do you tend to cool parts of the Earth, you will also undoubtedly change rainfall patterns, potentially very significantly, and in ways, frankly, the climate scientists have very low confidence on. And then who sets a thermostat and all that. So if you kind of think about it, there's two things to do. The first is we have a whole lot of trash, and it kind of smells. So the first way is take the trash out, put it back in the ground. The second way is spray a lot of perfume in here, and hopefully we don't smell the trash anymore. So that's kind of what we had. We did a National Academy study on that a couple years ago. My worry about this is as we continue to not really address the root causes, and we said this in the report, that the very best thing to do is don't look for these silver bullets, address the root causes through adaptation and mitigation, basically get yourself onto non-carbon. But as we see more and more near real-time impacts that either are attributed or are perceived to be attributed to climate change, somebody, and it may not be the US, it could be some other actor, says, you know, I've had enough and I'm going to go do one of these things. And then what do we do? That's the point where everybody looks at their watch in the White House and realizes they have another meeting and asks me to leave. That's kind of what's happened. Okay, let me just finish up with here. So 2 guys who I kind of like, Admiral Nimitz from World War II and Secretary Shultz. He was Secretary of State. He was also head of the Money, Office of Management and Budget. Nothing's more dangerous than for a seaman to be grudging in taking precautions. So I talked about that risk management. And basically, Nimitz is saying, don't be an idiot, prepare while you can. Because once it gets bad, it's really hard. This was actually because his friend, Admiral Halsey, ran a battle group through a typhoon in December '44, sunk 3 Navy ships, killed 700 sailors. Nimitz was not happy about that. Schultz talks about, this was really for the ozone hole. Follow Reagan's example and take out an insurance policy. So I talk to a lot of people sort of on the center and center right, because I'm a retired admiral. I can usually go talk to them. So I don't have people like Joe Rahm and people like that up here, but I have people that, maybe can be more identified with people on the center or center-right, guys like Admiral Nimitz and George Shultz. So this gentleman here, Winston Churchill, is alleged to have said that Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility. So, although, of course, it turns out Churchill never said anything, it's all alleged to have said. But he's probably right on that. But I do really think that once we get focused, I mean, we are an amazing country, and we can do things. You think about Apollo 13, the more I read about that, the more I learn about that, by all rights, I think those astronauts should have been left, they should have died in space. And we didn't let that happen. Now, I know that's one thing and stuff, but we basically nationalized, we basically corralled the nation's engineering expertise in about 24 to 48 hours through NASA, and really smart people at NASA too, and we didn't let them die. So we can do amazing things when we get ourselves focused. We're not focused on this right now. But when we do, I think we'll do okay. But we got to do that. The Navy has a saying, the naval aviators have a saying that two things are no use to you when you fly: altitude above you and runway behind you. Think about that the next time you're on a United flight. But we're putting a bunch of runway behind us here, and we need to stop that. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Ma'am.
I wanted to ask, talking about risks at home, any insights into the risk levels with the Colorado River Water Compact? The Colorado
River Water Compact. I am not, we have somebody on the Penn State faculty who would be really, really good to talk to, Professor Lara Fowler. Lara Fowler, F-O-W-L-E-R. She's in the law school, and she actually does research on like water compacts and Western water compacts. Other than in general, what I can tell you is that south of 40 North, so in a lot of the region where the Colorado drains, irrespective of the demand signals, which of course have been coming up tremendously in the Southwest and in Mexico, the chances of significant drought and overall decrease in precipitation, as well as less snow. So when the rains come, they tend to fall more as rain and run off faster. All of those are feeding into, a tremendous number of what I understand to be very, very complex non-climate issues. Population growth, what is equitable distribution of water between the states and then between the United States and Mexico. And what's the saying out west? Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, right? So you've got all this water law, and all I understand of which is, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it's very, very serious if you live out there. It's really serious stuff. Lara Fowler, though, she is really the Penn State expert on the details of that. But I can tell you the climate, it's the make bad things worse. It's going to get worse.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you if, when addressing the United States military, do you talk about their, influence on the climate? How their industrial processes contribute to emissions and influencing other industries, American industries?
I don't a whole lot. And because the reason is that's going to start sounding like finger in the chest, and that tends to turn people off. And then somebody's going to say, well, yes, we're the largest fuel user in the U.S., but it's less than 1%. It's about 1% or so. So what happens then is you get into this very defensive, well, whatever I do, it's not making that much difference. What I have found works with the military is talk about this in terms of their mission, kind of like what I've done here. And first, talk about how do you adapt to make that work. And that gets you in the door. I don't even talk a ton about the science, but I talk about that. And then after you've done that for a little while, you'll get some person, usually the one with the budget spreadsheet, you know, maybe 40 years old, they've been in the government, they're what we would call GS-14 or so, and they say, hey, this stuff keeps getting more expensive for me. Is there any way around that? It's like, well, yes, there is. We can talk about the root cause. And the root cause is how do we now reduce greenhouse gases? And the DoD can, in fact, be part of that. But if you get to the DoD saying, hey, we're gonna do this sort of in and of ourselves, you know, whether it's right or wrong, you tend to get a lot of pushback. And the conversation stops, and it kind of becomes he said, she said, and you don't get any, you just don't go anywhere. So is that, you know, right in all aspects? Probably not, but I'll just tell you kind of what has worked. And what has worked is really working on first adaptation so they can do the mission, and then when they realize that adaptation gets expensive, then you can introduce the fact that we really, all of us, need to get our greenhouse gases down to 0. Thanks. Okay, who else? Okay, you've got the microphone.
Really great presentation, by the way. Thank
Thanks.
you. Also, so you mentioned countries like Denmark, United States, and China. They all have like arguably really stable infrastructure. So in terms of like fighting climate change and changing everything around, is this going to be more, you think, a global effort, or would it be more of, because there's countries like in Africa or Central America that don't have so much of a stable infrastructure. So would it be more of everyone kind of putting it together as much as they can, or like what initiatives?
Yeah, I think those are really, really good questions that are kind of on the leading edge of a lot of the research on adaptation. And the way I've been thinking about it, I mean, this is sort of very simplistic. If you could imagine a 2x2 matrix, and on one side it's your climate impact, but it's not even the absolute magnitude of climate impact, but how close to that climate impact are you getting to like being something lethal or breaking or a major crop failure? So I'll just give you an example. I mean, this October here at Penn State, last I checked, we're about 5 or 6 degrees above average. But is that being a lethal impact? I mean, hell no. I haven't turned my heat on in my house. I think it's wonderful. But if we were, let's say, in Central America or the Middle East or Africa, and we were that high, especially with heat indexes and humidity, I mean, this could be massively impacting crops. It could be massively impacting people, their health. So it becomes a lethal, a very, very serious impact. So that's one side of the matrix. How close to a sort of I'll call it a hard stop are we with the climate impacts? The other part is how well is society, that existing society, able to deal with it? Again, in America, well, we all come inside, we turn on our air conditioners, and it's like, okay. But if you live in a place where either you don't have air conditioning or you have air conditioners, but the power system never works, then you can be in trouble. Again, really simplistic example, but I think a lot of places outside the U.S., in the tropics, in the subtropics, they are both going to come up against these lethal or these hard stop impacts, and they are much less prepared for a variety of reasons, less resources, a lot of reasons to be able to deal with it. And my guess is they are going to. We're all gonna suffer, but they are gonna be the ones who really feel it chronically, day after day, probably more than we are to start with. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But this is a place where I think a lot more research can be done. Exactly how do these impacts play out? How do they play out around the globe? What are the second and third order consequences? There's a lot of people sort of asking these questions, but I haven't seen. There's a lot of work to be done there. I think those are great questions you pose. Thanks.
You said that you don't think that we can solve climate change in like one of our lifetimes. What if the world forces us to? What if we run out of like energy sources or anything like that? Like, will the world end in your opinion, or will we figure it out?
Okay. So could you say that a little bit closer to the microphone? I don't think the mic picked you up there.
You said that you don't think that we'll solve climate change.
Mm-hmm.
What if the world like forces us to solve it? What if we run out of an energy source? What if we will the world just end, or will we figure out a way? Like, what do you think would happen?
Okay, so if I understand the question is, what if basically the world forces us to solve this? So here's kind of what I'm thinking is going to happen. I mean, we're sort of in this paradox. It seems like we keep finding more and more oil and more natural gas. I mean, I remember when I was here as an undergrad way back when, and even in high school, you know, people said, oh, in 5 years, in 10 years, you know, we're going to basically have used up all the oil we have. And that doesn't even count the coal, because we probably got 400 or 500 years at least of coal still buried in the ground, where I hope it really stays. So I'm not optimistic that the absence of fossil fuels in and of itself is going to drive us to clean energy. So I think there's always going to be some people looking at, well, geez, I can just go fill up my car with gas, or I can run my power plant on coal. You know, maybe not in the U.S., but maybe in other countries there. What I would hope is that the non-carbon based fuels become sufficiently cost competitive, and or we put a true price on carbon. So yes, you can use that gas, that diesel, that natural gas, that coal, but you really need to pay the true price, including the damages that come from the other end. And that, along with like wind and solar and things like that, you know, may kind of level out the playing field so that we choose. I sometimes tell people, you know, we did not end the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We moved to something better. And that's what I think is going to happen. But it's going to take time. I mean, I would love to see like a Manhattan Project, a Marshall Project, you know, use your thing you want to call it, and say, in 10 years, you know, the world becomes 70 or 80 or 90% carbon-free in energy. I don't see that happening. I wish I did. And the other part why I say we're all going to live with this is there is, on the physical science side, there's a tremendous lag. We're seriously out of balance right now. So imagine like if you're, you know, maybe your grandfather or your uncle's got, you know, some big old F-350 pickup truck, diesel thing. And you can mash on the accelerator, but it takes a while for that thing to go. Well, basically, we've mashed on the accelerator, and we've got at least 30 years worth of lag. So even if somehow, if I was king for a day and boom, zero carbon tomorrow, we would probably still warm up for another 30 years. So by the time we did that, you guys are all in your 50s. That's why I'm pretty confident with my forecast that we're going to deal with a changing climate for all of your lifetimes. And we're not going to go to zero carbon anytime in the near future. So my guess is at least the 21st and probably much of the 22nd century, the climate will be changing until we get to some sort of new stabilization. Maybe by then we'll figure out how to pull out at an economical rate, put the greenhouse gases back into the earth and stabilize that way. But that's pretty far out there. I think for everybody here, when you guys go out and get jobs, you're going to be dealing with a changing climate. And that's going to be the reality. And then it's just how much of a change and how do we manage that kind of change, and how do we buy down the worst of the risk there so we don't have the catastrophic change. Thanks. Okay.
Can you talk about? Okay. Can you talk about why climate change became a political issue that people could choose an opinion on, and how that has affected how our country has chosen to deal with or not deal with climate change?
Well, the second part is the easy part of that. It has tremendously delayed any kind of what I'll call rational policy discussion. As I kind of mentioned, and I sort of joke about it, that this is really cutting-edge 19th century science. So, I mean, the science is actually, we've known this stuff, and it's, you know, just as a tiny aside here, the 19th century, they figured this stuff out, and then there was actually a part of the early 20th century, I mean, reputable scientists really thought that the ocean was going to absorb all the excess carbon dioxide. So there was like, up until, let's say, World War II, from early 1900s to World War II, we really thought, yes, we're putting in greenhouse gases, yes, we know what they do, but the ocean's going to absorb them all and it's not going to be an issue. And then we started measuring. There was a guy, the Keeling curve, and a guy named Revell out in San Diego, just after World War II, started doing measurements, and it's like, oh, you know what? This stuff is coming up and up and up in the atmosphere, and you do a molecular decomposition, and you find out, yeah, it's the stuff we're digging up from the ground. So we've known for decades and decades and decades. So the science isn't really the issue. I think what's happened in here is there were sort of three forces at work, and they kind of converged. And has anybody read Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt? It's actually a pretty interesting book. It's not the whole story, and I like her. I've had dinner with her a few times. I've taken her out to dinner, but I think she sometimes leans a little bit into the conspiracy side, but her book is well worth reading. And you find that many of the same people who have been they've been effective at instilling doubt into the whole climate argument were the exact same people who were working for the tobacco companies. And the exact same people who said acid rain has nothing to happen. And the exact same people who said DDT is actually good for you and things like that. And it's really three things, I think, that motivates them. There is a very libertarian streak that runs through chunks of America, and including some pretty powerful people, that they figure that anything that requires government regulation or government intervention is bad. And individuals should decide everything, and that's it. There should be basically no boundaries on our playing field. We should do whatever we kind of want to do. There are then people who feel that if you regulate greenhouse gases, you will make energy unaffordable, and I have to drive 50 miles to work every day, or I have to have a pickup truck because I work on a farm, or I'm a contractor and you're going to drive me out of business. There are people who figure if we do this, if we take care of greenhouse gases, but other people in the world don't, all the American jobs are going to go to China or pick your country. And then, yes, there are the oil companies who make a ton of money doing what they're doing right now. So they're kind of have a vested economic interest in the status quo as being pretty good to them. So you sort of got these 3-4 things all converging. And I would say, though, that the ideology piece has probably been among the most destructive. I'll just use that word in this. I think, anybody here in medical side, we're in the life sciences building, so I'll bet somebody knows this. But I think what the science started to figure out that smoking tobacco was pretty unhealthy and dangerous for humans, I think it was in the 1930s. But when did we finally get around to really starting to get serious? Just in the US, there's plenty of smoking still going on world around. It took 60, 70 years of basically battling this. So you can kind of see the same thing playing out. It's really too bad because, the science is very, very settled. We understand the big picture on the science. So I think it's those things. What we do see, I will give you some optimism, I know, because I haven't done a ton of that here today. In 2016, before the election, the House of Representatives went on record as telling the Department of Defense, there is nothing to see here in climate change. Do not think about it. Do not do anything. And for God's sakes, don't spend any money on it. Now, that did not get passed into law, but that's where the House was, and the full House was there. Fast forward 12 months. Yes, we had an election. I would argue the political makeup of the House really didn't change much, maybe even got more conservative. Fast forward, now the House is on record as saying, hey, DOD, Department of Defense, tell us what you're doing about that climate change thing. I think it could be a serious thing, and you should pay attention to it and give us a report. Same House of Representatives. When this came up for a vote, 46 Republicans voted in favor of telling the Department of Defense, you need to pay attention to this. Another 8 Republicans realized at the exact moment of their vote that their Starbucks coffee cup had run amazingly dangerously low, and they had to not vote. So they abstained because they had to fill up their coffee cup. So if you add up 8 plus 46, you get 54, which is about 1/4 of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, sort of the bastion of evil for climate change, right? 1/4 of them actually voted, or at least did not oppose. I apologize for the double negative, but did not oppose climate legislation, sensible. I mean, this is not going to solve anything. It basically tells the Department of Defense to write a report. This is not like going to change the world. But compared to where they were even 12 months ago, it's a huge change. And what we saw, I work for a non-governmental organization. We actually did an analysis of those. Who were those people? If you had a military base in your district, do you think that mattered? No. If you lived near the coast, do you think that mattered? No. How purple was your district? So more purplish districts, what are happening, and what that means is, not quite as far right, more purplish districts, but still represented by Republicans, they realized that the danger was greater, basically denying the climate change, because that swing vote was going to start swinging away from them, than getting skunked on their far right. Now, the hardcore Republican districts, they're still in the, hey, my danger is getting skunked on the far right. But we're seeing this movement in the population. And I tell people that Congress will not lead, but they can be led. And they are led by people. So one of the talks I gave last year was actually to the LGBTQ caucus here on campus. And it was fascinating because I congratulated them, because that is an organization, or that is a movement that was really able to change the dynamics, the social dynamics in America like that, basically, right? Less than a decade. And that gives me hope. And I tell my climate friends, you guys should really take a look. It's not a perfect analogy. They don't have ExxonMobil fighting them. I get that. But they tried, that movement tried for years and years, a very legalistic message. Nobody cared. And they found a message, very simple. I love my spouse, you should be able to love yours. Very simple message. And everyone said, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And the dynamics changed, and they changed very rapidly. So I tell my climate friends, it's like, look, maybe we just haven't found the right message yet. So don't keep locked on to polar bears, because we tried polar bears for 35 years, and it really hasn't done much. Maybe you should try something else. Is this stuff that I talk about? I don't know. But it's a different message. And if this isn't it, maybe it's health. And if it's not health, maybe it's economics. Maybe it's new jobs with renewables. But different messages, and find either which one or which ones people say, oh, yeah, well, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I'm with you on that. And then I'd say, well, go tell your congressman. Ask your congressman or woman, what are you doing, sir or ma'am, to stabilize the climate? And then you can give them some ideas along these things. That it may not just be the polar bear on the ice floe. And I think we can change things. I think you're seeing this in the House. You don't see it in the news because we're all too busy dissecting the latest tweet out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But there are things changing right now. And it's changing because the American public's changing. Who would have thought in this administration we'd see that change? But the Congress is actually becoming more responsive to climate than the administration right now. So I'll leave with that good news. It is actually good news. And we need to, you as voters, need to let your representatives know, one, you care, and ask them, what are they doing? You don't have to say, do you support cap and trade or a carbon tax, but ask them what they're doing and let them know you care about this issue. And you're going to think about it in November when you vote. They listen. They really do. It scares the crap out of them. It's good. So, okay, that was my big diatribe on that, but it's a great question, and there is reason for hope. I think, though, that I took my one optimist, though, and I made him so depressed he's gone now, so he didn't hear my hope. Okay, what else? Are we done, or is that it?
That's all we have for
That's
today.
all we have. Okay, thank
Give
you.
a round of applause for Dr. Titley.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay,
Once again, I think we have some leftover food, so feel free to take.
there we go.
You can drop off the plastic bins over at the tables, or keep them for yourselves, and then compost everything else. Once again, feel free to hang out and chat for a few more minutes. You can stay as long as you guys would like, and talk more with Dr. Titley with each other. Next week, we have another showcase series, so make sure to go on our website, RSVP if you haven't already, and check it out. I'm really excited for the rest of the speakers we have for this semester. Thanks so much, guys, and hope you have a great weekend. Oh, and beat Michigan.